and welcome back to my corner of the internet. I'm Shannon, and today I've got another book talk video to share with you guys. And today we are talking about Ernest Hemingway. I'm going to be talking about two of my favorite books of his. The other day I was going back through my book talk videos, and while I know I've mentioned specific Hemingway books in the past, I hadn't done a video specific to Hemingway, so I thought now's the time. As you're watching this, I'm actually away on vacation, so I pre-filmed this to go up, and this is actually the first video I'm pre-filming, although it won't be the first one you're seeing. The first book that I want to talk about is my favorite book of his. One we're going to be talking about is the complete collection of short stories, and then the other one is just a standalone book, and this is my favorite of his. For me, with Hemingway, it's hard to pick a favorite. He's so special. I know that as a person, as a man, you know, he wasn't a great husband, he wasn't a great father, so in a lot of ways, you know, when you look at him as a person, it leaves a bit to be desired. But as a writer myself, he inspired me in so many ways because he was so good and so talented at so many different things. So the book that I want to talk about is A Movable Feast. So this book was published after he had died, and it was published in 1964, and it's a memoir of the time he spent in the 1920s in Paris. The story paints such a vivid portrait of Paris post-World War I, and it shares a lot about different relationships that he had, including his relationships with the Fitzgeralds, F. Scott and Zelda, and it just transports you to this amazing time, and there's something romantic about it because of the time and the place. And as always, it's written in that Hemingway style that just gets me every single time. There's a fantastic quote in here. Let me see if I can find it and share it with you. I found it, and in finding it, I found so many other quotes. So here's just a few from this book that will sort of give you a taste of the writing in case you're not familiar but interested. At one part, he says, "We would be together and have our books, and at night be warm in bed together with the windows open and the stars bright." Or, "We ate well and cheaply, and drank well and cheaply, and slept well and warm together and loved each other." Another one, "But Paris was a very old city, and we were very young, and nothing was simple there, not even poverty, nor sudden money, nor the moonlight, nor right and wrong, nor the breathing of someone who lay beside you in the moonlight." I like this one too. It says, "You expected to be sad in the fall. Part of you died each year when the leaves fell from the trees, and their branches were bare against the wind and the cold wintry light. But you knew there would always be the spring, as you knew the river would flow again after it was frozen. When the cold rains kept on and killed the spring, it was as though a young person died for no reason." So it's just, the thing about Hemingway I always found is there's happiness and hopefulness in his books, but they're always paired with despair and sadness. And that's something I love in a writer, I guess. He writes simply, but he writes powerfully. And in no place, in my opinion, is that more evident than in A Movable Feast. I love the cover too. This is the restored edition. The great thing about it too is it also has photos from the time. Let me see if I can find a good one here. It's him there in Hadley. There's Gertrude Stein. He visited her in her apartment. So there's all kinds of photos, and then there's one of him later in the 20s. I just love seeing the photos and hearing his tales, because all of those writers at that time seem to have been there, like Fitzgerald and Hemingway and Ezra Pound and Gertrude Stein, and there's so many stories in here about all of them together. There's so many stories in here about Hemingway and the women in his life, which I love reading about. There's a lot of stories in here about his writing life, and I feel like he's honest in it. It feels honest to me. Maybe it isn't, but maybe it is, and it feels like it is. This edition too is kind of cool. It has a foreword written by Hemingway's son, and there's an introduction written by his grandson. So I thought that was really cool. If you are into any of those writers, you know, or if you're curious about the time period in Paris from the perspective of a creative, I think you would love this book. I think you'd love it. It's great. Even if you're not super familiar with Hemingway himself, it's great. It's just a great memoir. So yeah, I would definitely recommend. Now, on the other hand, if you're more wanting to delve into Hemingway's writing and are less concerned with Hemingway's experiences, I would 100% suggest picking up, it's a big one, but picking up The Complete Stories of Ernest Hemingway. This has all of his short stories, including 7 that had never been published before. They're published for the first time in this. And this book is everything. It's one of my favorite books of all time. There are a ton. There are a ton of short stories in here. And of course I can't go through every single short story or else we'd be here forever. But I have to say that in my opinion, along with Stephen King, Ernest Hemingway was the master of the short story. To me, those are the two. If you want to see how a short story is to be written, look to those two writers. Because a short story is such a tricky beast. They're so difficult to write well. You don't have the time and space like you do with a novel. You need to get that punch packed real quick in a short amount of time. And both of those two just nail it almost every single time. In this particular collection, some of the stories are harder to read than others. There's a lot of, you know, hunting, fishing, war, murder. I remember once talking to somebody about it and they're like, somebody dies every 10 pages or so, and that's not too far off from accurate. But there's also a lot of love, and there's a lot of humility and a lot of humanity, and again a lot of that hope and happiness paired with depression and despair. And it's just, it speaks to me a lot of the human condition. When you're reading the stories, they're laid out and presented as something. But then when you spend time and you think about it and you get deeper into the story, you realize that what he's presenting isn't necessarily what he's presenting. And I love that. Hemingway is a master of many things. He's a master of dialogue, for one. He's a master of minimal writing. He can say a lot with very few words, which is something that's such a incredible talent. He's good at, like I said, saying a lot without having to beat you over the head with it. He's the master of character. There's so much to Hemingway to unpack. The first time I read this book, I was a teenager, and I was too young for it. It didn't do much for me at that point. I got bored real easy with some of the stories and kind of just, my eyes would glaze over and I couldn't get through all of them. But when I revisited it again in my 30s, I was absolutely blown away. And this has some of the, you know, the famous short stories that you may have already read before, like Hills Like White Elephants and The Snows of Kilimanjaro. Those are in there. Also, A Clean, Well-Lighted Place is in there. Plus, there's dozens of stories in here. And if you haven't read them, give them a read. You might find that it's the kind of book where you read one short story and then you put the book down for, you know, a couple weeks, go on, read something else, and then come back to it, which I did a couple of times while I was reading this. But it works well. It works for that. And, you know, it's just, I find it really fantastic. I will say another little book of Hemingway's that I like, and it's this little tiny volume, which I think is up in my office because I couldn't find it right before I came to film. It's a really slim volume. It's quotes from Ernest Hemingway about writing, and I found that so interesting listening to his thoughts, because he had some real interesting thoughts about writing. I actually had one of his quotes that a friend had bought for me on Etsy, and it was on a little pendant that you could wear on a necklace, and it simply said, "Write drunk, edit sober." That made me laugh. Anyway, you guys, so I just wanted to share these two books with you. I would love to know if you enjoy Hemingway. What are your favorites? What books do you love? And if you enjoyed this, if you enjoy hearing about Hemingway, I could later on go on and do a book talk about like maybe my top 3 favorite Hemingway novels. But for now, I really wanted to just talk about, first of all, A Movable Feast. So fantastic. And then the short stories. Love them. If you've read the short stories, which one's your favorite? Maybe I might do that too in an upcoming book talk. I might talk about my 3 favorite stories from this book so we can go a bit more in depth with it. Maybe? Like I said, I'm in a whole other continent right now, but I hope you are enjoying your summer, and I will see you on Monday. Bye guys!